Well, good evening. I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be here because I think this is a really important forum. And I'm really looking forward to the opportunity at the end of this when we can open it up and get some questions going, because one of the things that I firmly believe in is discourse or dialogue. And I think a lot of the problems between labor and management can be solved by that too. And I'll kind of come back to that full circle at the end. I've been active all my life in unions. This is actually my third career. I know you're probably saying, my God, how could you get that much life being as young as you are? But I actually have been a member of the International Brotherhood of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, as I know you were also, Local 701. I was a member of United Auto Workers. That was my first career. Then I was a member of the Fraternal Order of Police. I spent most of my adult life in policing up in Lake County. Any Lake Countyans here? Because we're going to come back. Where at?
Waukegan.
Oh, we're going to talk about Waukegan. Gurney, my hometown. So again, spent most of my time there with the FOP. Nice thing about that was we were not union when I first started. So the union came in. So I was on both sides of the union issue. As a patrol officer and sergeant, and that's where our break was. Anybody sergeant and below could belong to collective bargaining. Anybody above that, lieutenant and above, was considered management and couldn't belong to the collective bargaining agent. You could belong to the social lodge, so you could go hang out with the guys and eat pizza and drink beer, but you couldn't be part of the collective bargaining thing, which I thought was a little bizarre too, because there was a little bit of a rift there sometimes. And then lastly, being here, coming to Western, for my third career, being a part of UPI, the University Professionals of Illinois, and now being director, again, no longer union. So my whole life has kind of been, you come in as a member, you move up through the ranks, now you're no longer a member. And the thing that was interesting about that, I always thought, or at least the unique perspective I had, is one day you're labor and you're working side by side with your buddies, and the next day you're their boss and you're working under a whole different set of rules. So, you know, we had a lot of that transition, and so I might look at things maybe a little bit differently because, again, most in law enforcement, a little bit more on the conservative side. But, you know, what I want to talk about tonight a little bit is from both sides of that issue, not just one. Because public safety is a rather unique animal, and we have a lot of legislation that guides us in a different direction because we are public safety. So we are expected to be there. So, for example, when somebody kicks your door in at 3 o'clock in the morning and has a loaded .357 Magnum and you pick up the phone and dial 911, my guess is you probably expect a police officer to arrive at your house. Okay, well, what if that police officer isn't there? And we actually have that in Illinois. Different story, has nothing to do with labor, but in California, for example, they have legislation that says if you are incorporated, if you're a town of any size, you have to have a police department. We don't have that in Illinois. And some of our students who come from, say, Chicago, are amazed to hear that because, you know, perception is reality. Now, everybody's got a police department. Not necessarily true. But what happens is they get that coverage through either the county or the state or things like that. But my point is, in public safety, we expect the police to be there. How many here by show of hands are going into law enforcement? That's it? Wow. Largest program on campus? We got one? Oh, I'm going to pick on you later then. Oh, all right. Because again, one of the things that you give up kind of knowing when you go in, and I was going to ask you to going into policing, do you expect to get rich being police officers? Anybody here going into teaching? Wow, I think we hit the right crowd. Any of you expect to get rich? You know, you're going to be driving BMWs here after the first year on the job? Probably not. My point is those of us that go into public safety don't expect to go into public safety to get rich. My son came out of the elementary education program here, which I think is a phenomenal program. He's making $24,000 a year. I think that's criminal. How do you live on that? And it's tough. You know, he's having a hard time. But he says, I love what I'm doing. I love the kids. This is the career that I chose. So, you know, I deal with it. So there are trade-offs in life is the point that I'm trying to make. Trade-offs such as public safety, police, fire. You work what? Weekends, holidays, Christmas, your birthday, 4th of July. You know, the family's having a picnic. You're working midnights. Sorry, I got to get some sleep. It's a different situation than the private sector. So number one, what we do is a little bit different. A little bit of a history lesson here, so to speak. Back in 1919, we had the Boston police strike. And police officers were basically protesting wages and working conditions. So they went on strike. Well, what happens when the police go on strike and that guy busts into your home at 3 o'clock in the morning? That's a problem, isn't it? When nobody shows up, nobody's working. So what came out of that, and I know there's a lot of other things, we're trying to cram basically a whole century plus into 5 more minutes here, but basically out of incidents like that became clauses in contracts, became legislation in states, no strike clauses. We don't want public sector, in particular police and fire, to be able to strike. So what typically happens when it comes to the end of a contract and we don't have a new contract in place? What do you think happens with police officers? Can they go on strike? Can they go home and say, I'll come back when we have a new contract? No, they continue to work. And then what we do, which was always kind of nice, what we do is, once a new contract is settled, if there's a pay increase, we get a retroactive paycheck to make up for the difference. That was nice. But, you know, again, we're still working. And it was a good faith kind of agreement. Well, I say agreement, but what did labor have to do? They had no choice, right? They had to abide by that. Then we also saw this, a little bit of history. Back in the early days, you know, even prior to the 1919, you know, how do you think most people got their jobs as police officers? I know some of the older people in the crowd should have an answer here. Who were the police officers? Family. And here's another one. Think political machine. Patronage jobs, absolutely. If you were out there basically you know, pushing for certain candidates and they got elected, you got a job. You got a job whether it was working as a trash collector, a police officer, a firefighter. Well, that might be a problem, don't you think? What if you're trying to get a job and you don't have that connection? What if you get a job, but, ooh, you didn't. You were for the opposition. You know, might you be treated differently? Sure. So again, long story short, overgeneralization. But we saw what? The advent of the Pendleton Act, which brought a civil service law. And basically, civil service was supposed to be a buffer between public safety officers, fire, so we have civil service, police and fire commissions, and what? The management, city or state, county government. So basically, we have this quote-unquote independent buffer between the two. Well, the only problem is, who do you think appoints the Civil Service Commission in most cities? Yeah, city government, the mayor. So is it really a fair and impartial, you know, situation? And I'll give you a good example. I know of a town, won't name it, but I know of a town where the head of the Civil Service Commission was very pro-labor, loved the police officers, loved the firefighters, and was really in their camp and was a great guy, and it was a great working relationship. New police chief comes in. Of course, this is on the heels of what? This particular town actually was another one of those situations that was not union originally, went union. They brought in someone and said, you know what? We want you to mess with these people. They wanted to go union, and this was an anti-union town, and actually in this case, the mayor of this town actually owned a business which wanted to go union. They struck for years and years and years, and they picketed out there for years. He said, we're not going union. Well, he was angered when the police went union. They were the first ones. Eventually, fire went, public works went. But anyway, he hired a chief to come in and with the specific orders, make life miserable for him. You want a union? We're going to bring out a clean sheet of paper when it comes to negotiating. Not really a fair fight, right? You know, shouldn't we kind of start with what we got and negotiate from there? But that wasn't the attitude in this particular town. So it made for a little bit of a unique or different situation. But anyway, going back to my story, as the head of the Civil Service Commission, kind of started to butt heads with the new police chief because the new police chief was messing with people and what was happening. They were going to the Civil Service Commission saying, hey, I want a civil service hearing because I've been reprimanded, and that's another thing in public safety. If it's 3 days or under, you get suspended without pay, too bad. You don't have any real recourse there. If it's over that, okay, now we can get the union involved and you can get the Civil Service Commission involved. So public sector, again, a little bit different. But anyway, what happened here is police chief went to the mayor and said, the head of the Civil Service Commission is really impeding what we're trying to do in this community. I need him gone. Ooh, I'm not so sure that's a good move. They argued back and forth. Eventually, boom, he was gone. Things turned a whole different direction with the flavor of that Civil Service Commission. So my point is, are they really always an independent, neutral buffer? No, not necessarily. So are there politics still involved? Sure. Waukegan, good example. Fast forward, 1970. Can't strike. can't go out on strike. But Waukegan at that time, at least, and I know a lot of people who actually were a part of that and lost their jobs, but claimed the police chief was a real autocrat. It was a really tough place to work for. Didn't like it. They were complaining about wages. Starting patrol officer pay at that time was about $9,500, which sounds pitiful today, but when I started it was $11,000, so it wasn't that far removed. It was competitive for the day. But they wanted better wages, better working conditions. They wanted to strike. They couldn't strike. So they wanted to unionize, and the mayor up there at the time, Sabanjan, who was very strong anti-labor, said no, or anti-union, said, no, you're not going to strike. And it basically came to a head. And they decided, they were looking, what are we going to do? Should we, what labor organization, what union should we go with? And they actually decided at the time, there was one called the Cook County Police Association, which is what they went with. And even they said, yeah, you can't strike. But what we can do is what? Work slowdown. So the first thing they did was a work slowdown. They stopped writing tickets. What happens when you stop writing tickets? Revenue. Number one, revenue goes down, but guess what else happened? Traffic fatalities. They had 13 of them during that time. And what did management say, or the city? It's because you guys aren't out enforcing the traffic laws, and now we have people dying on the streets, and tried to turn the tables and put it on union, right? So what's the other thing you can do if you can't strike? Besides work slowdown? Call in sick. The blue flu, right? Me, because we all wear blue uniforms. Well, actually, that's another story too, which from Waukegan, I can give you a little bit of trivia along the way. They had blue uniforms, like most did at the time. And so they said, we're going to organize a massive sick leave. And that night, for midnight shift, they all called in sick. It was one sergeant and the deputy chief of police there. And they didn't know what to do. Well, luckily, not much happened because the public didn't know this was going on. But in the days that followed, they got the county, Lake County Sheriff's Department, to come in and patrol the streets. And then we had this big battle that ensued between the police union and the city. And long story short on this is, I really better speed up. Long story short then is, in this case, I really have to jump ahead, is police officers were fired. The mayor said, well, then we're going to fire y'all. And actually what they did, until they could get new people hired, is they brought in the state police. So if any of you have noticed, Waukegan's police uniforms are basically the same color as the state police, because as they started to integrate the new officers in, they wanted them to all look the same. So a little trivia for you there. But my point was, in public safety, they said, hey, if you're not really sick, then you did what? You lied. And can you be disciplined up to and including termination in law enforcement for lying? Yes. And so they rang them up on things like violation of your oath in office and all that stuff. My last point here, and I'll just try to bring this home and tie this up, is, I had a few other things, but in the interest of time, and maybe we can get to that, is public sector is a little bit different. And the way I look at the situation right now in Wisconsin is this. Who does state government have more control over, the public sector or the private sector? Can state government tell a business how to run their business? No. Can state government tell the public sector what to do? To a large degree, yes. Public sector is a lot easier nut to crack than the private sector. And then plus they have control over them. Now, my final thing here, and I'll get off stage, is this. I am a firm believer in this. If everybody played nice together and everybody lived up to their obligations, well, one, it'd be utopia, right? We wouldn't have a problem. But we probably wouldn't need unionization. Now, does, in my case, public sector, does cities, counties, states always play fair? Do they always have the best interest of labor at stake? No. So is there a need for unionization? I would contend yes. But do unions always play fair too? Not necessarily. We see that more in the private sector than the public sector, but some businesses have almost been held hostage by unions, right, when it comes to more wages, things like that. Here, in policing, everything that I've done, anytime there was any kind of a grievance or dispute, well, let's talk about it. What's the issue? And we resolved it. The one thing that I really didn't like was when union representation used to brag about grievances, the number of grievances they filed, because to me, that said, I'm not so sure you're doing your job. Have you tried to resolve it first? But again, like I said, what I think is happening in Wisconsin is, you look at what's happened with the situation with money, housing, salaries, you know, it came down. Just like you said earlier, Peter, was they need money. But my big fear is, are they going to spend it wisely? look at what got us into this place, in the first place. So I think there's a need for protection on that. I know.